don't. Please don't. Hello. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you're joining us from. Welcome to Books and Beer. Woo!
Woo!
And joining me today, Kevin Tumlinson. How are you, man? You well?
I am good. How are you? How's everything
Very well.
going?
Very well,
You're on
thank
the
you.
other side of the world from me, basically.
Basically, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. Long way
yeah,
away. Long way away. One day I'll make it over there, It's got to happen. It's got to. And
yeah,
likewise,
yeah.
have you been
Yeah,
to
same.
the UK before?
I have not. I'm looking forward to going, and I was planning to be there just before the pandemic made that less attractive. So
Yes.
I'm looking forward to it being attractive again.
Absolutely. Yeah, too right, too right. It'll be good to welcome you over here and share some British beers with you, which are
Yeah,
which are special in there. I think they're special anyway. I'm biased.
I'm gonna take your word for it. I'm in. I'm in.
Absolutely. Well, I've got well, it's an Irish beer, I suppose. Guinness. It's from Ireland, the Republic of Ireland.
Yeah,
I'll be
I'm a
pouring
big
that now.
fan of Guinness.
It's
Yeah.
difficult to pour though, isn't it? So I feel I'm going to embarrass myself now whilst I give it a go.
Do it. Let's see it. I feel so lame because we talked about this before we started rolling, but it's 11 a.m. here, and so I'm on green tea. So
There's nothing
I
wrong with that at 11
I've got a
a.m., mate.
couple of scotches and some bourbons off to my right. I can slip out there if I need to. Look at that pour.
I sort of feel that if you have a look at that, listen to that as well.
Oh,
You hear that?
that's gorgeous.
Sounds
That's
good, doesn't it?
ASMR right there.
Yeah,
That's
it
what I
really
want to
is.
hear. Yeah,
It sounds like white noise, doesn't it? It's that
that's
staticky
a
sort of thing.
comforting sound right there.
There we go. I think I'm quite impressed with that actually. I think
Yeah,
that's too bad.
look
I
at
didn't
that.
think
That's
it's
like
too
a
bad.
glass full of syrup right there. That
Watch
is
me now
delicious.
smash it over my computer, and the screen goes black, and it's the end of
Yes,
that.
I advise against that. Yeah.
Mm. Me too. Well, that is lovely. That is lovely. I'm interested to talk to you for loads of reasons. To be fair, your books, you're great. Your action adventure sort of style of writing, I
Yeah.
absolutely love. But you and I have both got this sort of travel thing in our
Yeah.
lives and our story, and I think you're doing it more. I think you do more of it than me at the moment, which is makes me jealous, but that's fine.
That's lovely. Yeah.
Tell us about your adventure in the
The,
RV.
the whole hashtag van life thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, we've for a couple of years now we've roamed the country in a van. The van is actually our fourth RV in a 4-year stretch. Like
Wow.
um, we bought a well, I guess it's like a pop-up A-liner camper like back in 2016, and then we traded that for a huge motorhome, like a 40-foot, nearly 40-foot motorhome, and then we downsized from well, we were renting that guy out, so we bought a bumper pole camper, 19-foot, and that was right as the pandemic was starting, and we were getting on the road. We had just exited a lease on an apartment, and we're getting on the road when they said lockdown for a few
Oh,
months. So we kind of locked down with her folks. But when we came out, we were living in a bumper pole trailer, and because things were still weird. You didn't know if you were going to have a restroom. You didn't know if there was a place to eat. Some campgrounds were closed down, and so we decided we would trade the truck and camper we had, and we got a travel van, camper van.
yeah.
So we lived in that full time over the past 2 years. We've had some reprieves in that we've stayed with her folks here and there, and they have an apartment here in Texas that we're sort of borrowing until our house is done at the end of the month. But yeah, for the most part, we lived out of that van, like less than 100
That's
square feet of
fantastic.
space, and traveled the country
Yeah.
and really enjoyed it. Yeah, it's been good.
It's must be such an experience. It's something that I've sort of got the bug for. To be fair, my wife and I borrowed one, just a little
Yeah,
VW one.
yeah,
So like a transporter, just for
yeah.
3 days. At the end of last year, and we loved it. She had a day of work to do, so she did it from the back, whilst I walked up a hill and back, and we sat in
Right.
the local pubs. And you know what? It was so much fun, just
Yeah,
moving on from one place to the next and seeing a different sort of side of the country. Really, I suppose.
yeah, yeah. And we had decided. So the whole idea behind the van was we carry everything with us everywhere. So at a certain point, we might have left. So if we had that trailer and that pickup, we might have been like 2 hours away from that campsite and tooling around or whatever. And if we decided we didn't want to go back, we had no choice but to go back and get the camper. But if we're in the van, make a quick call to whatever site we're paying for, or sometimes we were boondocking, we just go. And so it was just complete freedom to be wherever. And we worked. I mean, we were both working out of the van the whole time too. So it was a workspace as well as a living space.
So that's got to have made it even more challenging to be sort of right. Now we're putting away the breakfast stuff because that's my desk,
Yeah.
And now we're getting out this,
That's exactly how that works. And you develop like rhythms and routines. I had so the passenger seat of our van turns around and faces the interior of the cab. And so I would use that as my office.
And you have one of those desks on a bar that comes.
Well, so we had a little pedestal table, but we got rid of it. It just was taking up space. It wasn't very useful. So we use lap desks. Pay like $20 or $30 for a lap desk, and I would sit with I was usually doing most of my work on an iPad Pro because it's got its own internet connection. But laptop or whatever, you can sit and do your work. And we would park by a bay or park in a national forest or something and have like the ultimate view. And you finish up and you go outside, you take a walk, take the dog out, enjoy where you are. So
that's it. It just, it really, really speaks to me, that sort of lifestyle. Because I think in our sort of work, creative work, and I know the whole of an author's life isn't creative, but a large proportion of it is. And I want to sort of keep it that way, I think. You can't work 18-hour days, I don't think. You know what I mean? Your brain goes to sleep after a few. So actually being somewhere beautiful and actually going to experience what's around you is such a good idea, I think, in this sort of lifestyle.
It's a recharge. I remember, so there was a point where we were in South Dakota, and we went to the Custer State Park, I think is the name of it. It's a national forest, really. And it's beautiful there, and you're surrounded by mountains and forests. And we parked next to a lake, and we spent, we probably came back to that spot 2 or 3 times over the course of a week. But we'd spend the whole day there. You're just, that's the sort of like, that's what I pictured whenever I pictured traveling and writing in an RV or a camper. That was the exact scene. So when you're in that environment, like I said, I've got photos, Kara took photos of me sitting at like a picnic table or something with the lake and the mountains and everything behind me. I'm like, that's the stuff you always see like Instagrammers do, and here it was our real life every day. So yeah, it's very inspiring.
Yeah. Does that have an effect on your word counts and getting books? Not necessarily how many books you produce, but did it find its way into your stories? Did it impact
all of
your
that
stories?
Stuff has. My books always contain little snippets of my experiences on the road, and even with international travel, like you pick up these little nuances and details from these environments. You meet people, and you discover how similar we all are. I had this like epiphany one time. We were in Paris. It was my first time there, and we're driving around, and I remarked to Kara that this is I could see myself here. I could see myself having a life here because it wasn't so dramatically different from what I knew as I had feared it would be. And I've had similar experiences elsewhere in the country. So you get that feeling. And then it's almost like a cognitive dissonance because at the same time, you discover just how different and how diverse everything really is. And so, we're in Vermont or New York State or something in a landscape that we've never been to before, never explored before. And we're exploring it in a way that we never would have by simply flying there and renting a car. Like we'd never be off in the middle of the forest and in Vermont. We slept in this, we stayed in a lot of like these KOA campgrounds. This is pretty common. They're the high scale campgrounds. We stayed in a couple of those, but you're still in the middle of nowhere. You're still in a place where, it's just so foreign to what you're used to. It was a beautiful experience. I would recommend it to anybody, author or otherwise. I think if you can take the opportunity to travel for months at a time to any place, and I know that's not necessarily within reach of everyone, but in this age of everyone can work remotely now, all you got to do is make sure you got a stable internet connection, and you're in.
That's it.
Might as well be somewhere you love.
It is particularly attractive on a creative level, though, in my mind. Is the idea that you can refresh, because actually I don't know about you, but I find walking so great for ideas. When you we'll talk about your creative process in a minute. Actually, I want to talk about that, but you get yourself into a bit of a corner and you try and work out how something has happened, or sort of work out how your characters have got into that place. And all of a sudden you're out, you go for a walk for an hour, and it just figures it just falls into place, doesn't it? It just sort of works itself out,
And that's one of those like number one rules they give you for figuring out a tough problem, is to do something that relieves some of the stress and takes your mind off of it, and then let your mind wander. So taking a walk is one of the things they recommend, but like, taking a walk in your neighborhood is a little different from taking a walk up the side of a pine covered hill and somewhere in the middle of America. It's a different form of inspiration.
It is 100%. I think that, and it's also being sort of away from other people. I think that's very powerful as well, and being out in the wilderness, the perception of wilderness, even if it's on a track and the trail, and
even if you're really just 150 feet from a highway.
That's it.
It's it has an impact. Nature is really very therapeutic. Like I have a great love for, and I think my wife has caught on to this, because she tended to find us places where I could go wander in the woods. We stayed in places where right in the campground itself would be trails, and I'd be surrounded by forests, and I'd be walking alongside lakes and streams and things like that. I love that stuff. Like, I grew up outdoors. Almost literally every minute of my childhood was barefoot running through the woods, basically. So it's kind of a callback. People make fun of me because I tend to wear flip-flops and cargo shorts. Like, that's part of my uniform. It doesn't matter what the temperature is. Yeah. I'm that year-round shorts guy that you keep seeing on the news. But, I'm walking around out in the middle of these, probably not wise, but I mean, I'm hiking in like flip-flops and cargo shorts, so it feels like my natural element to me.
It sounds ideal to me. It absolutely does. We're going to talk about your creative process in a moment. I'm interested in that. Let's have a quick look
here
and see
for
who's
you.
Joining us on the
I've
in
seen
the
a
chat
lot of
today.
Familiar names.
I know. We've got Alison is here, and Fiona is here.
Hi, Fiona.
And Ray is here.
Hey, Ray.
And there's a question. Ray says, plenty of beers, coffee, tea, depending on where in the world you are. Yes, he's remarking on our drink.
Yeah.
On our drink choices, and he's got a question for you. I don't know if we'll answer this. Let's go for this now. But as we've talked, would you want to go back to Sistel's sci-fi fantasy future alternative world series, because you've written all over the sort of map, haven't you? As much as you've travelled, you. Which one came first then? Was it the sort of sci-fi?
I was born in sci-fi. Like, that was my first love, first stories I ever wrote, and it was the first book I ever self-published was a sci-fi novel, the first of a trilogy. And I absolutely love writing sci-fi. I one of the hangups I have is that I have a hard time finding the subcategory of sci-fi that I fit into, because I grew up. I'm a huge fan of the work of Orson Scott Card, at least the earlier stuff, and his later stuff has gotten a little awkward to me. But the Ender's Game was the novel that opened my eyes to the idea that you can actually be an author for a living. and I wrote stories that were kind of similar to those in a way, where the sci-fi was there and it was definitely the point, but it was more about the characters. So my stuff is always very character driven. To answer Ray's question, I mean, I very much intend to start writing more sci-fi. I've got some fantasy stuff that I'm kicking around. I wrote a short story that I just submitted to Analog, so I'm kind of hopeful that they'll pick that up. But yeah, the point really is, as much as I'm known as a thriller author these days, I am just an author. Like, I will write anything that I, find that drives me, that feels passionate to me.
Do you know what? I really like that attitude, and I think in this world of the way books are bought and sold, I think there's an over sort of perception in categorizing things, both readers and authors. And actually, I don't think it's true, because I think a lot of readers read all sorts of different things. I know I do, and I think everyone on the call today would admit they read thrillers, but they probably also read other stuff as well, and a lot of authors probably think I would write other stuff as well. It's nice to do that, and I think it shows breadth and depth and all these sorts of good sort of traits. Is that something you're sort of aiming for, or are you just following the heart sort of thing? Oh, I've lost your sound, mate, or have you lost mine? 1 minute.
That's my fault. That is my fault. I muted myself to clear my throat and did not unmute myself.
Oh, so you're not just a Slurpee tea drinker, are you? So you're
There's a little bit of extra in here. Yeah. So, yes, I think if I can get my brain back on track with your question, I very much was following. I follow my heart in terms of what I write. I do have a marketing and business strategy to what I write as well. I have what I call my money books. The Dan Kotler books, that's a money book. The Quake Runner, Alex Kane books, those are money books. So I have to keep a flow of those going if I want the money to continue. What I love, though, is kind of pushing myself to kind of try new things and explore certain limits and see, how far can I take this? And really, honestly, I've said this from the very beginning. Like, if you took my side, one of the reasons I switched from sci-fi to thrillers, aside from Nick Thacker daring me to write a thriller,
it's all Nick Thacker's fault.
Everything is Nick Thacker's fault. But one of the things that caused me to want to shift was I would tell people I was an author, and they'd say, "Well, what's the name of your book?" Or "What do you write?" And I'd say, "Well, I have this sci-fi trilogy." And then inevitably, I'd say probably 99% of the time, they'd say, "Oh, I don't read sci-fi." And meanwhile, they're telling me all about the, how much they love Star Wars and how much they love the Avengers. And, so I realized that sci-fi as a label has a kind of stigma to it, just like self-publishing used to have a stigma to it, right? Sci-fi as a label has a sort of stigma in that people tend to treat it like it's just something that only guys who live in their mother's basement read or whatever. And so they don't want to associate with it.
Or guys who live in a caravan down by a lake read it.
Exactly.
Walk around in shorts all of the year.
I'm just about as cliche as they get. So my whole thing was, I would tell people, you could take my characters and lift them out of that sci-fi environment and put them in literally any other story, and they would work, because it's about the characters. So I shifted to writing thrillers because basically what I'm writing is really still sci-fi, especially the Alex Kane books. Like, that's technological thrillers. It's really sci-fi. I mean, it's all ideas I've had for decades, just set in a contemporary world. And so I like that idea because it allows me to explore various concepts that I've always been interested in. Dan Kotler, I mean, he's an anthropologist, but he also has a degree in quantum physics. So, I mean, I get to throw in some of this stuff, anyway, the stuff that was going into my sci-fi, like, I'll throw some of that in, and I really get to stretch there. But I like the sci-fi genre, the pure sci-fi genre. I just have never been able to find my real place in it.
Yeah, so, I can imagine that, and I can imagine it is a difficult one to sort of find those people who are focused and interested in that. But it is such a broad thing, isn't it? Because you have they might be set on a planet, on a spaceship, on the world in the future. There's lots of different elements that go into that story.
Honestly, if your setting is a spaceship or another planet, I mean, it's sci-fi by default, right? Now, I like what Analog does. They're just one of the magazines I will submit to from time to time, but their whole thing is science fiction, according to their definition, is something in which the science is integral to the plot in such a way that if you were to remove it, the plot falls apart. Mm-hmm. And so I would actually argue that I haven't written sci-fi, because if you were to take the science out of those books, they still stand.
They're character stories.
Yeah. So
that's it. And I think you're right. But I think that's what makes a great story in a lot of ways, is that character being character driven, regardless of whether it's set in contemporary America, in a country on the other side of the world, or as I say, a spaceship or a planet. Somewhere else. So tell me about your process then. That you go through when you write one of these books. Do you sit down and know, right? This is a new Dan Kotler thriller. This is what I'm working on. Here's my plot. Here's what I'm going to do. What sort of prescription do you write out before? What sort of ingredients do you write out before?
There is really only one thing that I know when I start a book, and that's the title. And sometimes I will start a book based on a title, and I think it's going to be, say, one of my Dan Kotler books. But as I start, I realize it's a Quake Runner, Alex Kane book, and so, or it's an evergreen, or it's something standalone. So I start with a title, and 99% of the time I actually have the title and I know what series I'm writing for or whatever. But once I know the title, I don't even know what the plot's going to be. I just start writing. I'm a complete pantser. And then because I know the title, I know I have to tie in a theme to it. And so that evolves as I write. So
that's such a great way to do it.
Yeah, it's a complete discovery method, but it's not for everybody. I mean, I'm not going to push this as, the way to do it for anyone, but it's worked for me now for since 2006. So
you've done several you've done well out of it with several books and a lot of success with the books that you've written. So stick with it. I don't think you should change it now. How do those titles appear to you then? Where does that initial flash of inspiration occur?
They'll come from all over the place. So sometimes it'll just be like I have a clever turn of phrase pops into my head, and so I think that'd be a great title. I'm very, very good with titles. Okay. and headlines and things like that. I think it comes from my experience as a professional copywriter. Like I would have to come up with, I remember there were exercises early on. I'd have like the senior copywriter would be talking to all those little grunts, and the exercise would be come up with 50 headlines for this article. And you come up with your 50 and they say, okay, now pick the 10 best ones. And then you pick the 10, now pick the 3, now pick the 1, now throw that out and write 25 more headlines. And so, after you've gone through that kind of brutal mental boot camp, you get pretty good at kind of summarizing complex thoughts in as few characters as possible. It's what makes me a grand master on Twitter. But I have, the titles come from that, or occasionally the title presents itself because of my research. So, and what I don't do is, okay, I'm going to write this book. Now I'm going to go research it. I am a continuous researcher. Like I am always looking into different stories that interest me and that maybe provide some fodder for a story, some grist for the mill, So as an example, I was just kicking around on YouTube, last year, and YouTube recommends a video about something called the Demon Core, and I watched the video, and then I go do a little bit of research, and I look through Wikipedia and some news articles, things like that. And the Demon Core was the third unused plutonium core for an atomic bomb that would have been dropped on Japan, but they didn't have to because 2 was apparently enough. And so that core went back to Los Alamos, where it was experimented on by physicists, and a lot of research was done on it. And it got its name, the Demon Core, because 2 different really moronic physicists were playing around with it in very unsafe ways and ended up killing themselves and other people with it. So eventually it was melted down and put back into the nation's plutonium reserves. Okay, so that's the facts. That's the history. But the phrase Demon Core was just
a great
titillating
phrase.
all on its own, right?
Yeah.
So I'm like, okay, well, I have to write a book called The Demon Core. And if I'm going to write the book, I might as well reference the history. And so I did. So that's an example of a title and research that came together for me, rather than me thinking of a title first and then going and finding, the story that fits.
I know exactly what you mean. And people ask me similar questions about my books. And I always think I go for sort of a 1% fact, sprinkle a load of whatever else on it, and the story sort of emerges from that, like a tiny little pinprick of fact, and the rest sort of appears.
You give me the tiniest historic fact or historic quirk, and I'm going to run with it. I mean, here's what's amazing to me. I think that there's a somewhat maybe almost an element of psychic cognition involved with fiction writers at times, because often I will write something and I know for a fact that I made up, the bulk of that story, like 3/4 of that story. The history is just made up BS. And I will inevitably get a review from someone saying, 5-star review saying, I love reading about history and archaeology, and I went and looked this up, and it's just amazing. This author really does his research, and they just praise me for illuminating this like rare fact that no one's ever really talked about. Like, I did not go research that. I made that up, but it turned out to be fairly accurate. So I don't know if that's because of all the research I do, there's a kind of soup in my head of, a mishmash stew of ideas that maybe I am accessing.
This does also slightly worry me, though, because the amount of arguments I've gone, not arguments, discussions I've gone into with people because I heard something on a film or read something in a book and believed it and have fought to,
Hey, look, I never claim that everything is factual. However, I will say this. I get more negative feedback over genuine, actual facts that I have researched than I get over the stuff that I made up. And
that seems funny, isn't it?
Yeah. I will tell someone something along the lines of, I did a little piece on the Northwoods hermit. Okay. He's this guy that lived off grid in the Northwoods in, I think, Vermont. And, for 25 years, he lived in this little patch of forest, literally 150 feet away from the closest occupied rental cabin, vacation cabin. And he lived on, like, he would go and steal from this local kids camp. He'd steal from the cabins, but he built himself a little compound of tents and stuff inside this patch of forest. He lived there all alone, no contact with another human being for 25 years. So I did a whole little podcast on that. And there are people who pop in to tell me all these things I supposedly got wrong about this. And I'm like, I have all the research. Like, these are facts, but people like to correct you on those things. But if I had said the guy had 2 heads, I mean, it'd be like, it's remarkable how.
Oh, he was doing some kind of weird black magic stuff going on. Yeah. They'd have been like, yeah, true. Call him out.
This checks out.
Yeah. That's it. It's such a fascinating process, and I love talking to other authors about their sort of creativity and how it all comes together in that final thing of a book. But you've created all sorts of things in your career, haven't you? You know, copywriting, and you worked in sort of documentary making and this sort of thing as well.
Yeah, I did. I worked in documentary, film, and TV for a few years, mostly historical stuff, mostly aircraft related.
Okay.
I got involved with a guy who was very big into the historic aircraft restoration movement, and then from there we ended up doing a special on. There was a special forces operation in 1973 called Operation Tailwind, which came into some public scrutiny when CNN ran this expose claiming that we had used sarin nerve gas, which was is against the Geneva Convention. So they instantly labeled all these guys as war criminals, which is punishable by death, really. So we were doing some documentary film work around that story, and the attorney that was basically going after CNN for it. And so, that was one of the bigger things I did. But yeah, I did a ton of that stuff for like PBS and Discovery Channel, Discovery Health, History Channel, all that. So
it's
that was a part of the career.
Were these documentaries that were like an hour in length, or were they sort of a shorter thing that would fit within a news bulletin or within a other program?
We were primarily doing series.
Right.
So, we had some standalone things, like the original Honor Squadrons was a standalone thing we did for PBS. It was like their biggest pledge drive generator for years. And then we expanded that into a 10-episode miniseries. The Tailwind thing was a one-off. And that one, I don't think we would have been able to turn it into a series, but it was kind of tied to the court case, so it was a little weird. But a lot of the other stuff, it was segments. I did a lot of segments, for like Discovery Health, for example. Like we covered this kid who had a procedure. He weighed nearly 400 pounds as a 14-year-old, and they had this procedure, and we followed him from the procedure to the weight loss to having I forget what they call that procedure where they take away all the excess skin. So I got to be in the operating room while that was happening.
I'd like that.
Yeah, it wasn't my favorite moment, but it was interesting, and having things like that show up on these major networks is kind of a nice feather.
I'm interested then, how are there similarities? Because they're both sort of storytelling, aren't they? Both these writing a novel and making a documentary. Sure, the documentary one is more, we'd hope, was more factual. You're not just making stuff up to fill it out for a few minutes. What similarities are there between those two sort of tasks, or those two elements of storytelling?
They're actually quite similar. I think at heart, I probably am more storyteller than author. When it comes down to it, because I have produced content across a very wide array of outlets, books just being one of them, but writing has always been my first love. But the similarities, like for example, the Tailwind thing, I built that. We do what's called a paper edit. So you go and you do all these. We had 250 plus hours of interviews. Okay. Wow. You're not going to do a single documentary that's 250 hours long unless you're Peter Jackson. But we had all this footage. And so we had it transcribed, and I spent months reading transcriptions, watching clips, getting a feel for what I wanted to the story I wanted to tell. And I did what's called a paper edit, which was I literally took, at that time, those 3x5 note cards, and I would write the quote and the you annotate the tapes, by then it was on hard drives, but you say it's this footage. You give the labels. Like, so it's tape
2 minutes
1,
in, 5 minutes in, or whatever.
Right. And so and there's an annotation that you use for that. So in that way, I would stick that card up on the board and just build the show, and then I could rearrange things. And once I had that, then I gave my editor a single sheet with all those um, numbers, all the time code, and he edited it together. And then I sat with him and edited the whole process. Now, the thing I took from that I've used since then, that process was what made me start using Scrivener as my writing software, because Scrivener has that bulletin board, the index cards, right? And I was convinced that if I was going to be an actual author, I needed to outline. And my only experience with outlining a story was that method. So at first, that's how I tried to do it. And it just became cumbersome. And I ended up giving up on it and just going straight to the writing, which is where I am now. But, it still influenced what it taught me was that I can take these pieces from my research, this YouTube video, this book I've read, this article I read, this conversation I had with a friend, and I can start putting those pieces together to form a story. And so really that's how those stories come about. I joke, or I don't joke. I literally don't outline, but I do outline in that as I'm writing. Yeah. I already have a general idea. And as I'm writing, I say, okay, well, this would work and this would work. The thing I love about Scrivener is how it's so nonlinear, just like video editing. It's this whole nonlinear process. I can actually grab a scene, move it up here. Yes. I've done that, So
do you find then, because your stories, you follow various different perspectives through your stories and different characters and whatever. Do you find that you write one perspective first and then we'll drop in the other sort of viewpoint later, or is it in that way that you would if you were a filmmaker? You might record it all from one person's thing and then come back and do the others, perhaps. I don't know.
I have done that, but that's not my default. I actually am pretty good about switching gears. I actually did this today where I wrote a scene from the perspective of my protagonist, and then I knew I needed a scene from the antagonist as a counterpoint. So I switched gears and wrote that scene this morning. And I'm pretty good about that. Like I flow pretty quickly from one POV to another throughout the book. And my books do tend to jump POVs from time to time, because that's, to me, it's a good way. I love the method of putting a character in a tight spot and then shifting away for a chapter or at least a scene, so that the reader has to wonder what happened to that character.
Yes, I agree.
I think that's a great method, and I use it all the time, unconsciously. Really, I mean, it's really pretty amazing. Like I don't feel like I've studied craft much at all in my career, but I accept that I read continuously.
I feel that's a real filmmaker's technique, though, what you've just described there, and because you've got sort of the protagonist fighting, and then you skip to this guard who's on the toilet with a newspaper singing a song, and he's hearing some bangs going on in the building, and he's like, what's that? Checking his watch, whatever, and then it cuts back to the other scene, and it just, as you say, it spaces it out, and it adds that.
My favorite example of that is Sam Raimi's the Spider-Man 2 film that Sam Raimi directed, and Spider-Man and Doc Ock are having this fight, and they break through the wall of a library or something. And in the foreground, Stan Lee is wearing a set of headphones, listening to classical music and bebopping his head. And in the background, Spider-Man and Doc Ock are going back and forth, beating the crap out of each other. And that's, I want the literary version of that scene in my books.
Yeah, it's clever, isn't it? And it makes it. I sometimes I see this in TV and in film, and in books. Sorry. And the writers make it too serious, I think. And it's all too high tension and all too high pressure. And I find it a bit like, I don't enjoy it as much as what you've just described, where, yes, they're having a fight. Yes, there's stuff on the line. We know that. But let's just have a light-hearted moment and put something a tiny little bit light-hearted in there to relieve some of that pressure. Or give us a laugh.
Nothing will connect you to your readers better than giving them an unexpected laugh. Especially if you've been building tension for 3 chapters, Most of my characters, my main characters, have a kind of dry sense of humor, and they're very clever. Everyone's clever. They're all 9 times more clever than I even hope I would be, and so
hey, they come from you. Don't do yourself a disservice. You and Wikipedia.
Take too much credit. So inserting, and I have a dry sense of humor myself, so I naturally default to witticisms in the face of overwhelming odds, and I think that's a good way. I've seen it overdone. I was reading Brad Meltzer's The Escape Artist, and he completely overuses this. Like I'm not going to trash the guy's work. I mean, he's a very good author. He's very successful, but I hated this book because I'm like, I just can't stand the characters. Because there is a difference between being able to crack wise in the middle of a fight or in the middle of danger, and cracking wise with literally every word out of your stupid mouth, which is what he does. So he wants to establish this guy's a cool player, but he does it by literally the character is so annoying that he's annoying other characters in the book. I'm like, what kind of subconscious play is that?
I know what you mean. Yes, it's like a spice, isn't it, or something like that you put on every so often. That's a
very good way to put it. It's almost like you're an author.
I know. Who'd have thought it? No, it's absolutely fascinating to talk to hear how those two things of what you think they've got in common and that sort of thing. Let's have a quick look over on the comments.
We got
a
lot of questions
here. I know. Ray suggests we could both enjoy historic fiction. I think so, actually. Could you see yourself, Kevin, doing a historical?
I actually I think I would enjoy that quite a bit. I mean, I like the more contemporary stuff, and there's certainly a lighter research load when it comes to that. But I've written scenes that are set in in history, in deep history. So it's not a foreign idea to me, but yeah, totally.
But I mean, now you could do, this is the if I was to do a historic fiction thing, and I suppose this is like, you could argue whether it's historical fiction or not. I think it would count. A sort of book set in the 90s or the early 2000s. I lived in those times, but it would still count as historical,
Well, we've noticed, my wife and I, as we're watching, TV and stuff, that, there's a real trend towards doing shows set in the 90s now. And
yes.
It was the 80s up until 2020, and now it's the 90s. And I'm like, so we've now lived long enough that our more formative years are now historical callbacks. So
that's it. And the music you enjoy is used ironically to sort of make a point, about that period. Oh, how quaint and trite the music was in that era. Yeah,
I mean, we're watching The Great. It's like a highly fictionalized version of Catherine the Great's life, and there's every episode features some 80s pop song or 90s pop song, so it's a little jarring to see that in a historical context. Songs that I sort of remember as, that song's on my iPhone right now. I just listened to it the other day, and it pops up in,
that's
early mid-century or something.
Allison's being a bit cheeky here.
I could never aspire to be Ernest Dempsey. Although many have claimed that none of us are actually real, and that we're all just one author, me, Ernie, and Nick. But I could never aspire to drink Ernest Dempsey's bathwater.
Yeah, I saw you all in the same place. I wasn't there, but I saw you in the same place at Florida in the conference.
Except Nick wasn't there. Nick Thacker wasn't there. So here's what's happened.
So there's two of you pretending to be three.
There's only ever two of us together.
Right.
It's kind of like the president and vice president aren't allowed to fly together. we're not allowed to all three be in the same place at the same time, or the world could lose its primary supply of B-list
archaeological fiction.
Archaeological fiction. Now, so Nick and Ernie actually went to 20 Books Vegas this past November, and I was supposed to be there, and that would have been the very first time that all three of us were together in the same place at the same time. But as the universe apparently does not want that to happen, events conspired to prevent me from being able to go. So
I'm not sure anyone could cope with that, to be honest.
What would happen? I'm just curious. Like, what would happen?
You'd certainly have a load of new titles by the end of the weekend that you could put into your next dozen or so books.
Well, the three of us have a Facebook private chat together, and it's called Dempsey Dollars, Thacker Stacks, and Kevin Coins, and it's our version of the what was the name of the group?
The Rat Pack.
No, the Tolkien and C.S. Lewis.
The
Inklings. That's our version of the Inklings.
I like it.
Yeah, didn't start off that way. Just started off randomly, but we've maintained that. So, and I'm very grateful for it. Like, these two guys are inspirations to me too.
Well, you all are. You all inspirations to me, and I know a lot of people who'll be watching this as well. Wilma says she loves your books, all series. Especially like the notes after the stories.
My notes at the end.
After the stories. I must have missed that.
Oh, you got to read that. What do you
put at the end then? What is...
So I started doing this very early on. Like at the end of every book is a kind of... You would call it an author's note, right? But what I call it is... I named it a note at the end. And every one of them's called this. It used to be stuff at the end of the book. That's what I used to call it. But... decided I would grow it up a little, but it is sometimes it's sort of like a little essay or blog post at the end of every book that explains some of what went into it. Sometimes I talk about like the research I did, or I zero in on a character and talk about that character's development. But sometimes it's just me expressing like a related, perspective. I've gotten in trouble for some of them, accused of being political or whatever, because, I'm a conservative and I see things a certain way and I have certain dislikes. And so I don't trash people. That's a rule I have. I want a positive world. But some people just see the mere fact of proclaiming yourself conservatives being offensive. So I've had people leave me 1-star reviews that say, I read this book. They'll say, read the author's note first. And then they give me 1 star and criticize me for being political. And
that's brilliant, isn't it?
Like,
but surely there's a load of people who have the same political views at you that would be like, yes.
They do. And I would actually say that in the spectrum of mouth foaming political rhetoric, I am well in the center.
You're
I'm
moderate.
Slightly right of center. Yeah. Because I was not a fan of Donald Trump at all ever. I didn't like him when he was on The Apprentice. I thought he was a jerk from the beginning, so I didn't vote for Trump. So when people start screaming, that I'm a Trump supporter and things like that, it's kind of amusing to me. It's like I actually voted for Obama in his first, term as president, not in his second term. But I mean, I vote for the person I think, if I vote at all, I know that one's going to get some people mad at me. But if I vote in an election at all, I vote for the person that I feel is the most distinguished and best qualified.
I think that's the best way to do it, isn't it?
Yeah.
You've got to just go with your feelings at the time.
Yep.
To skirt around the tricky issue of politics on the show, I think we did that pretty well, actually, to be fair. Let's go back to books. Steve Taylor says he's done the same thing. He's talking about book titles, by the way. Yeah. He's done the same things with 2 books where he's thought of the title, loved them, and wrote the book from it. So I think this is, and I suppose in a way I have done, because I go with the place first, which is inadvertently the title of the book.
Yeah. You have to find the starting point that works for you, and it has to be something that's going to inspire you enough to spend hours and hours and blow, hundreds of thousands of words onto a page, or 80,000, that's my general word
Is that
count.
yours? Yeah.
So, you got to find something that's going to motivate you to keep going in that. And for me, the title is always, it's intriguing because I want to see what the payoff is. Some of my titles are not as intriguing as others, but that first sci-fi trilogy I wrote, Citadel so the point of that was we were going to write a television, a streaming series before streaming existed, before Netflix and Hulu let you stream stuff. We were going to make a television series that we put on YouTube, and
good idea.
It was going to be called Citadel. And so those were early days. Well, I was having trouble getting my head around what the story would be, and so I wrote a treatment that ended up becoming the first book. And since the series was going to be called Citadel was part of the title, and I thought, well, I'll make this a trilogy, and each book is Citadel : something. And so the first one was called First Colony, the second one was called Children of Darkness, the third one was called Paths in Darkness, and the third one was Children of Light. And those are intriguing titles all on their own. So and that's the way I loved operating. And then when you read those books, those titles are very pertinent to the plot of the book. So
it's a nice way to do it, isn't it? Because I can imagine, had you have written the book,
yeah,
then to come back and write the title would have, what do you call it? Like, that would have been quite a complicated sort of process,
Yeah, and I always feel like I'm somehow stunted when I try to do something like that, especially like a short story. If I don't have a title for a short story, I never finish it.
How many short stories? I mean, probably better to ask, do you do short stories frequently rather than how many? Because there may be hundreds.
not as frequently as I used to, but I've written hundreds of short stories for certain, and had some published traditionally, and had some, I've won contests and things, so, short fiction is a unique kind of beast. It's actually harder for me than long form.
And each one stands alone. They're not just a bit from one of your series that you've sort of.
I have done tie-in short stories, especially in the Citadel universe. I've got 2 novellas that I've published, or is it 3? I've got some novellas that I wrote. They're tied into, but they are interestingly enough, one of them is completely standalone from the books. It's in that universe, uses the same technology, but doesn't even reference the events of the books. So, I do that a lot. I like that.
I think it's a good idea, and it's something I'd like to do more of. I always think it's something, because you've got that as sometimes a story doesn't need 80,000 words, does it? Sometimes right. you sort of run out of. I mean, that's a good point. Do you sit to write that novel and know that it will be a novel, or does it end up sometimes being a short story, a novella, or whatever else, or even a series separately?
Well, I've had the reverse thing happen, where I sat down to write a short story and it turned into a novel. But I've never sat down to write a novel and decided that, no, this story's over after the 3rd chapter or something. I've never done that. But no, what I have done is a lot of my early novels were in the 60,000 word range, because that was what felt like a natural length to me. And but interestingly enough, in those days I had trouble with editing. I didn't like to edit. I didn't like to rewrite. Now I love it. It's weird. It's a weird flip, but because I love it, I actually end up writing 80,000 words almost by instinct, because I'll write the story. I do what I call loop back, and then do my rewrites. And in the rewrite, I generally add like another, 20,000 words. So, hitting an 80,000 word mark is pretty easy these days. So,
how long would that take you then from title to publication on that 80,000 words?
Things have varied somewhat since I've been doing work for Draft to Digital. But in the days before Draft to Digital, I'd write a draft of a book in about 15 days. That'd be the first draft. And then now it's more like, 30 days I've got a draft. So, and sometimes faster, sometimes slower. It just depends on what my workload is. But, I generally aim to put about 2,000 words minimum on the page each day. And And I typically go well over that. But on busy days, that's almost pushing it. But at 2,000 words a day, I mean, if you really think about that, if you're aiming at 60,000 words, you've got a book in a month.
Yeah.
So that's a significant number of words to commit to, but it's been very beneficial for me.
That's a serious amount. Like,
yeah,
to do the 2,000 a day, I can do that. I could figure that, but then when you put it in the context of the novel in 2 weeks, 80,000 in 2 weeks.
Well, and that was the whole thing, right? Like when I first self-published out, it took me like 2 years to write the first book, and 2 years to write the next one. And I decided I needed to step things up if I really wanted to have a career at this and be prolific. And I came up with the whole 30-day author formula. I wrote a book about this and everything. And there's really no magic to it other than, sit down and commit to a number of words to write each day and write those words. And once you develop the discipline of it, it's not really that hard to churn a book out quickly. It's hard to get started.
Right. It's hard to get started, isn't it? Yeah. And it's hard to sometimes see the wood for the trees when you're in the middle of the process. And there's challenges at every stage, I think, isn't there? There's that challenge at the start, as you say, getting started. In the middle, you don't quite know where things are going, and you've got to sort of keep it in the right way. And at the end, you've got that balance of action spliced to character development, spliced to giving enough away to satisfy that book, but wanting it to sort of not be completely finished because it's a series and you want the next. That there are challenges all the way through.
Exactly. Yeah.
One more question. Alison's got a great question here I'd like us to talk about, and then we'll get things wrapped up because we're almost at an hour, which has gone incredibly quickly.
Yeah.
Who's been the most challenging character to write and continue writing out of your books thus far?
I mean, if we're talking protagonists, I guess I'd have to say that Dan Collar is actually the most challenging, and largely because when I first started writing that character, it was on a dare. It wasn't something I didn't know that I was going to continue writing books in that universe for indefinitely. And so I set certain things up with that character that I later came to regret, only because I have to pay those things off regularly or the whole thing kind of falls apart.
Are you able to say what? Yeah.
Yeah. So, early on, I wanted him to be a multi-hyphenate PhD, and so I introduced him as being a PhD in anthropology and a PhD in quantum physics. And the reason I did that was the quantum physics part of it was me sticking close to the shore. Okay. Like that was, I had come out of sci-fi. So I thought, well, if it ever comes down to it, because he's got this quantum physics background, at least I can fold in some sci-fi elements and make him, fit that world. And so I did that, and I've used that from time to time. But what it ended up being was a kind of almost non sequitur kind of. I had to invent a reason for that later that I didn't have to worry about in the first book. And so I introduced the idea of his parents both being in scientific fields and having an interest in anthropology, and then I could expand out from there. So he basically, because they die, Kotler, being who he is, took on like the things they were interested in as his own mission. Like he's going to carry on for them. So I introduced that whole idea. And then I've had books that relied on his quantum physics background. But what I didn't want was for every story to revolve around that. And I wish instead of quantum physics, I had said something like forensics, because then that would have really played in.
It's more tangible, isn't it? To sort of put into a story,
It would have fit perfectly, and having partnering up with the FBI. But because I didn't do that, I introduced a character named Elizabeth Ludlam, who is a forensics lead, who is now the head of the whole historic crimes division, which is this unit I made up.
I like it.
And but she's the head of that now, and because she has a background in forensics, I get to stretch those legs every now and then. So really, the mistakes end up mistakes are kind of the author's best friend, because if you've screwed up, like for example, historic crimes, I wrote that, it made it all the way through to publication, and then I realized, oh, I meant historical crimes, not historic crimes. I said it wrong. So what I did was write in a joke in the next book saying, isn't it supposed to be historical crimes? And Denzel's like, yeah, I didn't name the department, Kotler. And then now we've got this running joke that there's this bureaucratic typo that defines the whole unit. So.
Oh, I like that. What a great story. I like those sorts of little jokes that end up going through, and they entertain you and maybe a couple of other people who notice them, ongoing. Kevin, this has been fantastic. Thank you so much for joining me. I really enjoyed it.
Absolutely, man. I've loved it. I'm really grateful you had me on.
Oh, you're so welcome. Where can people find you and your books and all of the things that you write and talk about on the internet?
Everything I do of any significance is findable at kevintumlinson.com, and that's pretty much all that I do, is all encapsulated there. So stop by, say hi, get a free book.
Absolutely. kevintumlinson.com. Make sure you check that out. Next week on Books and Beer, we've got David Wood joining me, which will be great fun. He is here in the flesh, as we say. Yeah. So I'll be cracking open another beer for that one. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for tuning in. This has been brilliant. I love doing these, as you know. Make sure you are here next week. If you're on YouTube, like and subscribe and all that business. And if you're on Facebook, if you can follow my page, that is so much appreciated. Thank you so much, and I'll see you again soon.
Take care, everybody.